It's a great pleasure to welcome Ted Hogue from HP Labs. Ted has a background in physics and computer science and has degrees from Caltech and Stanford. Ted today will be talking about reputation mechanisms for electronic commerce. Ted.
Thank you very much for the invitation. And if you have questions along the way, feel free to bring them up. What I'd like to start with is just to give a context of reputation in sort of an area that I'm sure we're all very familiar with if you've ever had the opportunity of buying a used car, particularly from a private dealer. And you face this question of how do you tell if it's a good car or not? And you have various options, particularly if you're not that mechanically inclined. You can pay someone to help you out, threaten to go to court if you get a bad deal, and so on. But another and sometimes easier way is relying on the reputation of the seller if they've done this kind of transaction many times in the past. And that's really what we're going to focus on today, is looking at different reputation mechanisms. Fundamentally, this problem, such as buying a used car from someone who knows quite well how the car runs, but you don't, is an issue of information asymmetry. And this basically just means that two people are thinking they might have a beneficial transaction, such as getting rid of an old car. One person knows a lot more about this product or service than the other person does. And because of the concern that you might be buying a lemon, people might be inhibited from entering into these potentially beneficial trades. The market collapses, goes away, and essentially people end up leaving profitable trades on the table if they're not comfortable in assuming that they'll get an honest transaction. There's a variety of examples in this, in a more modern context than buying cars. Things like, I'm a business and I have web ads, and is someone clicking on my ad? Is that really a customer or someone a robot trying to waste my ad budget? Is some software I'm thinking of downloading, is it full of bugs and viruses and spyware, or is it really useful as advertised? So the issue of reputation and information asymmetry comes up in what you might call the old economy, and that's buying the car example, and also very much in the internet economy. And what I'm then going to be describing in this talk is basically what is the economic challenge for which reputation mechanisms can be helpful. I'll describe, just as some motivating examples, some information services that the internet can provide that require people to feel comfortable both in the providing and the using of information for which reputation can be helpful. You're probably all familiar with a lot of the more web-based examples, and so I'll describe some other kinds of instances where there's a lot of potential benefit, but people can be afraid of sharing information more from the physical world. And then turn to looking at what are some various kinds of reputation mechanisms and how do we go about evaluating them. And finally, I'll describe some experiments that we've done at HP in comparing a number of different reputation contexts in very controlled, although small environments. So the economic challenge for a reputation mechanism is we'd like to induce honest behavior among people when they have the temptation to cheat because they have some information that the other party to the transaction does not have. And the idea is that a good mechanism should help reduce the consequences of this information asymmetry so that the people feel comfortable making a transaction even though they know that they're lacking some information. And reputation is one way of going about this. And it's not the only way, but it has advantages of avoiding the really potentially expensive costs of detailed monitoring or after the fact legal enforcement. So if you can prevent the problem in the first place, it's a lot better than trying to fix it afterwards. It's important to understand as we talk about reputation that human nature is still very much the same. The difficulty of enforcing contracts or encouraging people to behave as they promise is certainly not something that's new. In particular, interesting example of in the Middle Ages, merchants had to deal with this. who had lots of profitable trades between different countries, but say a merchant from France couldn't really trust that the King of England and their courts would give them a fair deal if they had to have some dispute. So they often faced issues of, how can I trust someone when I don't really have clear access to legal contract enforcement? The idea of reputation is really very simple, and that is you give some record of, let's say, my past behavior in various similar transactions as some presumption of how I will behave in the future, realizing that any poor behavior on my part could be punished by the loss of future business rather than, say, being dragged off to court right for that particular transaction. And then a question that comes up is, in this broad context, how might we go about designing effective reputation mechanisms for various situations, and hopefully that are easy to implement and use? Now, it's important to remember that when we talk about human behavior and mechanisms and incentives, that when you put a mechanism in place, it can change the way people behave. They're not just static with fixed behaviors. And so here is just one example. It's not particularly related to reputation, but you might think about your behavior, if you're all similar to me, in the question of whether you bother to put links to other web pages you find that are interesting. So I remember very early on in the web, you would find interesting pages and you'd put links to them and so on. And then after a while, those web pages go away, or they change their URLs and they're hard to find. And it becomes a real pain to maintain your own web page when other things that you link to keep changing. And so now, hey, there's great search engines. You don't need to bother to put in links. You can let people just give a little text summary and let people find it if they want via search engine. That will be up to date, and you don't have to worry about updating your web pages so much. Of course, the problem then can come if people rely on search engines rather than putting in links. You're no longer presenting that information of endorsements, if you like, by having people explicitly put in links to their pages. And if many people then adopt this kind of attitude, there will be fewer links. Maybe it's harder to search and harder for mechanisms that rely on the recommendations from links. And so this is just as an example of where you change a technology, you change a mechanism, it could change people's behavior to possibly make that mechanism less effective. And it's useful to keep that in mind in any kind of mechanism design. And so before we talk more about specifics of mechanisms and economics and so on, I'd like to just put the context of a design into three different categories, and often people tend to focus on just one of these three, and I think it's important to keep in mind all of them and let them balance off against each other. So if you have a car in the parking lot, one thing you'll typically do is lock the door when you leave, and that's an example of a simple technology, a lock, that makes it harder for people to break in your car and steal stuff. Another way, of course, is just don't leave valuable things sitting around in plain view in your car. You're trying to take away the incentive. Someone could break in, but they have no particular reason to do so. So that's more of an economic kind of issue. And finally, there is a level of legal sanctions. Yes, you could break into my car and steal stuff, but potentially the police could come after you. And if you get caught, you could be punished. These various approaches to trying to encourage, if you like, correct or honest behavior have their strengths and weaknesses, and it's important not to just focus on just one of them and think that will solve everything. The focus I'm going to be talking about today is more on in the economic and in incentive context, but realizing that technology, in particular cryptographic tools, in terms of providing who has access to what information, can be an important component of reputation mechanisms and maintaining privacy and so on. So now let's look a bit at some information services, and I've just picked a few here, first that you'll be very familiar with, those are based on the web, and then I'm tossed in a few that are probably a little bit less familiar with you, to you, and they're not so common yet, although they provide some examples of some interesting searches that is so far beyond current technologies, but might be very interesting and have a key trust issue in terms of releasing and using the information, which is what I want to focus on here instead of the technological aspects. So of course, we're all familiar with the internet allowing new sorts of information services, particularly by lowering drastically the transaction costs. So if you want to find some specialized obscure information, who wants to sell some obscure item that you're interested in, or if you'd like to aggregate information from lots of different places, the internet makes that much, much easier than it has been in the past, and then therefore enabling new sorts of services at reasonable prices for people. Now, information sources, when we think about the internet and so on, often focus on online sources. What sorts of search activities do people have? What do they put on their web pages? What do they email and so on? Who do they link to in social networks? But there's also a variety of interesting possibilities and developing possibilities in the physical world for gaining information about the physical world and bringing this into online new sorts of services. In particular, surveillance sensors, cameras all around, whether they're the government's cameras or our own cameras and cell phones and so on. Who gets to know where your cell phone is all the time? So it's cell phone locations tied to you. And interestingly, for some new kinds of aggregate searches, some medical information. And let me just, because that I think will be a little bit less familiar to you, just want to go a little bit over what we might imagine some kind of searches that really rely on trust in information and not just because they're enabled by the technology. So if we have lots of distributed sensors and we're interested in environmental monitoring, and we could do this very cheaply and continuously and so on, we can monitor for chemicals that people are actually exposed to, for how long, how much, and so on, and then correlate to, say, disease outcomes with actual exposures and perhaps the specific genetic makeup of these people, and not have to make some more coarse-grained kind of inferences that we have to do today. So this could be particularly useful for the early identification of some, say, environmental toxins that are particularly of a problem, but to a very small minority of the population just because of their particular profile. That would otherwise take a long time to figure out. Another place that we could gather some interesting information, although again this is not what's happening yet, are these various implants that variety of companies are working on and in fact marketing today. So these are various devices that are implanted, say, to monitor your heart or your blood pressure or how a bone is healing. And these generally will be useful to give information to the physician treating that particular problem of how a treatment is going, is it getting better or worse, and so on. And these can give much more detailed information because it can collect information continuously than you would get, say, if you go to the doctor once a week or once a month. Now, another area that I'm particularly interested in, and at HP Labs working on molecular scale devices, and that is sort of molecular computers and sensors and so on, is taking this kind of capability that we already see at sort of scales about this size or millimeter scales, and developing the technologies that make this much smaller, so to be able to sense, compute, act on size scales particularly relevant for biology, say the size of cells. And here is kind of a schematic diagram of the kind of sizes that we're thinking of for applications of molecular electronics that's in the laboratory today, although we're nowhere near able to build these kind of devices and put them into clinical use. So the example here is just making a very small device that's a little bit smaller than cells, yes?
What does this have to do with reputation management?
I'm getting to that. It's a good question. So these sorts of implant devices are normally thought of to help you interact with your physician, and that's it. So that would help you. But these sorts of devices, if the information was widely shared, could also be used to provide detailed studies of, as I mentioned, environmental monitoring, who's particularly sensitive to certain kinds of exposures, and here's a potentially interesting search that is just impossible to do today, partly because of trust issues. And that is, if you have these people with their various implants measuring diabetics, blood pressure, exposure to various toxins, mainly for their own benefit, if that information could be widely searched and available and so on, it could also make possible virtual, very rapid, online studies for you come into your doctor's office, you're presented with some kind of flu perhaps or something see what that is, see how people with your genetic makeup have responded to that, to various treatments of that particular problem. If you could do it quickly, if you could do it accurately, and you could do it a sample over a large population, just imagine that the kinds of things of how that could change the specificity of, say, medical practice that we know of today. So this is an example of a kind of search that might be very obvious. I'd like to know who else that's similar to you in the relevant characteristics have had this particular problem that you're presenting to me as a physician. What has worked for them? What have other people tried, and so on? Can I find this out very quickly? And the answer today is no. Partly for technological reasons, but also partly for trust issues. What will happen to this information? So the idea of aggregating information, of course, can provide a combination of information that can provide improved services if you can use not only your own behavior, but behavior of similar people to you, whether it's because they're similar medically, or they're similar in terms of the searches that they've looked at, or their similar hobbies, or whatever the similarity might be, you could get better recommendations, better information for them. But of course, and here's where this issue of trust comes in, all this collected information, easily searched and so on, could also be misused. For example, to enable a really detailed kind of identity theft that people would know a lot about you potentially. And so this is just an example that I wanted to bring up because it's somewhat unusual when we think about, say, just web-based services, that there are certain kinds of searches that would be nice to have and nice to be able to do quickly, but for which trust is a really key blocker. If people, even if the technology were available, trust for people to have this information provided and so on can be a key blocker. And so as we think about reputation mechanisms, it's not just for finding a better car or finding a better apartment to live in or whether I should download this particular piece of software. There's a wider context to it, which I think raises a lot of interesting questions. So I hope that helped at least sort of give some context of why we should look at things that include collecting information from the physical world. So now let's turn a little bit more to the questions of reputation and why trust is important for when we aggregate or collect information sources. So if we're going to have some services that based on getting information that people voluntarily give, people have to trust however this information is going to be used enough so that they're willing to provide the information. And of course, on the other side, if you're a user of the information, you want it to be accurate, and it's not just some spoof or spam and so on. You have to feel that the information is reliable. So here I'm pointing out that there's asymmetric information potentially on both sides of a transaction here. One is I'm going to give you some information. You promise that it will only be used for these various uses that you promise and not for anything else. Can I trust that? On the other side, as a user of this information, I get something that gives me a recommendation. Can I trust it? Is the information reliable? So asymmetric information is not just on the seller side necessarily. It can be on both. And so if we can devise good reputation mechanisms and understand what makes them work and so on, it can be a key enabler for a variety of new services for which the technology may not be mature enough yet. But when it's there, we don't want to just be stopped by everyone loves the technology, but no one trusts it, and so they're not going to use it, or they'll lobby to pass legislation that restricts it in various ways that makes it less useful than it could be. Now, the internet has both positive and negative consequences for designing reputation mechanisms. And the obvious one is that it certainly can help by making a lot more information available about, say, a seller. What have they done in the past? How do their other customers feel about them, and so on? It's a lot easier to find that. An example is the eBay rating system, if any of you are familiar with or buy or sell things on eBay. Similarly with social networks, where you can get recommendations from friends of friends, and you might find those more trustworthy than just some random ones. The internet also provides challenges for reputation mechanisms compared to what we might be used to traditionally. In particular, you might be dealing with people in very different legal jurisdictions. This is, again, similar to what these medieval merchants were dealing with. If you're French and you don't trust whether the legal system in England, say, will help you. There might be anonymous users. You might not know exactly who it is you're dealing with, or if you've dealt with them in the past, or who they've dealt with in the past. You might be doing a transaction across different business cultures, where sort of different levels, if you like, of bargaining, cheating, whatever you care to call it, are the norms. And how do you deal with that? And also, you might be dealing with very small transactions. So imagine buying a small thing on eBay where it's just not worth the hassle of thinking of going to small claims court if it doesn't work out. And so these are kinds of things that make many of the kind of traditional ways we think of dealing with reputation a little bit more of a challenge. If we're thinking of putting together some possible reputation mechanisms, well, we would certainly like the information that we're going to use and help people make their decisions be easy to collect, and not require very much effort, if any, on the part of the person providing the information. We'd like the information to be accurate, so that I can't easily, if I'm competing with someone else to sell something on eBay, that I can't easily spoof their reputation and make it seem like they cheat a lot, whereas I don't. Because we'd like to encourage people to rely on the reputation and then see what are the consequences for improving and facilitating transactions that without a reputation mechanism people would feel uncomfortable doing. And then also, it would be nice if we could have some minimal intrusiveness for the people whose information we're collecting to maintain privacy. And hopefully, if people are concerned about privacy and would either withhold the information or distort or change their behavior because of that, perhaps in ways that, again, make transactions that would be beneficial just not happen because people are concerned about what trail of reputation they might be leaving behind. And a simple kind of example is if you're involved in transactions that some part of society or some other society might view as unpopular, maybe you don't want everyone to know about that. So all the gambling you did in Las Vegas, for example, things along those lines. And again, when you're crossing cultural and legal boundaries, something that might be perfectly fine in one context might not be in another. And how does that affect reputations if you're thinking of doing business in many different cultures? Or we see this also with search terms indicating something about you, perhaps. So the amount of reputation information that we want is kind of a balancing act. If you have too little, people will not feel constrained by the mechanism. There'll be free riding, cheating, and so on. And then people might feel, I can't tell whether what I'm going to get is a good thing or a lemon, and so I just will stay out of the market. The transactions don't happen. In the extreme, the market collapses, and there's a loss for everybody. If there's too much, it can be costly to collect. Maybe you have to verify it, which is costly. Maybe it's just even confusing to users to show hundreds of transactions and whether the person liked it or not, or was a little bit okay and not so okay, or rated different rating scores. Too much information can also be confusing, and also then, as I mentioned, privacy concerns. One issue that comes up is, should the information be verified independently, or it's just self-reporting? So third-party verification can make people feel more confident about the accuracy. And it also has the disadvantages, then it could be costly. Someone has to pay or motivate this third party. And perhaps forces some uniform evaluation criteria that may not be suitable for everyone. On the other hand, it's self-reporting, so I just decide we have a transaction and I just post a little thing on the net that says I like this transaction or I didn't like it. That can be fine, that can be very easy, but on the other hand, I don't necessarily have to tell the truth about it. And what sort of incentives are there for me to misrepresent what happened in the transaction? So as we then think of evaluating different proposed mechanisms, in looking at economic mechanisms in particular, but anything in which involve people, there's really basically three broad categories. If you're an academic, you might look at game theory. And this has a lot of general assumptions about the rationality of the actors and what they know and what they believe about other people and so on. And that can give some idea of, well, if there's some kind of equilibrium behavior to this mechanism, would it be a good one or not, and what might be the consequences. Then there can be field studies. You might say, well, let's look at some reputation mechanisms in use, say, particularly say on different websites, to have a look at actual behavior, not necessarily rational people, just you have large numbers of people involved, and see what happens. Now, generally, you don't, in a situation like that, you don't get to design the mechanism. You just have to look at whatever it is, say, that eBay decides to do. And because of that, you can get correlations, but you can't get causation. You don't have the ability to go in and say, well, let's just tweak this mechanism a little bit and see what happens. Or change the information that people have and so on. This actually is a familiar gripe in biological experiments as well, as you can monitor, say, the behavior of some cells and watch what things seem to be correlated, but unless you can do experiments where you can intervene and make controlled changes, it's very hard to get from correlation to causation. So the third kind of approach are experiments where you can do intervention studies. You can look at counterfactual scenarios that no one would be crazy enough to actually implement. Maybe they'd lose lots and lots of money. But that way you're able to test a wider variety of hypotheses. These experiments can be web-based, or the ones that I'll be describing are laboratory-based, where you have a lot of control over what information different people have. But on the other hand, they're limited in time and how many people are involved. So I would think none of these three methods are clearly better than the others. They each have something to contribute. They have their strengths and weaknesses. And ideally, if you're thinking of evaluating some mechanisms, you'll try to do all three in some appropriate combination. So today I'm going to be talking particularly about laboratory experiments, but that's just one way of evaluating mechanisms. So now I should turn to talk a little bit about some actual reputation mechanisms, starting with some fairly simple cases, and then we'll move to some more realistic ones. The concept of reputation is often studied in a scenario that's thought of as a cooperation dilemma of some sort, where you have a group of people, and there's some notion of good behavior and bad behavior, however you care to define that. And the good behavior has a benefit for the group as a whole, but it's costly to some individual, to all the individuals actually. Either it's because they have a cost to perform this beneficial action, or maybe in the context of, say, privacy concerns, they might be worried about an indirect cost that if they participate by revealing their information, somehow it might be misused against them later on. And so in a scenario like this, everyone has a temptation to free ride on the efforts of others. That is, you'd like to say, I don't want to incur my individual cost, but I sure hope everyone else in the group will participate so we can get the benefit for the group. Here's a very simple example that you might just think about if you've ever actually been in a situation like this. You're out to dinner with a group of friends, and let's say they're going to divide the cost afterwards equally. So what do you order? Cheap, expensive, compared to what everyone else is doing. And just think about it introspectively. Does it matter how big the group is? Usually if the larger group, you're a little bit more anonymous. Maybe you can get away with it. Do you expect to dine with these people again? Or at least anytime soon? Just thinking of those kind of questions and how they might impact what you think you would do or what you imagine other people might do is a perfect example of this kind of cooperation dilemma in a very small and kind of personal situation that we could probably all relate to. So this brings up the question of what is the context in which a mechanism will be used? Again, will you interact with this group again, or is it a one-shot deal? Can you select what group you join? Some cases yes, some cases no. And if you're born in a certain country, you're a citizen of that country. You never selected it. In other cases, you have to deliberately select to be part of some group or another. Say in picking what company you to work for. Can the group exclude you? Sometimes yes, and sometimes no. So in this kind of very simplified scenario where everyone just has basically one of two choices, I can either do the quote-unquote good behavior or cooperate, or the bad behavior or defect, and your choice can just be based on what the other person's past behavior was, and maybe it's just a one-on-one transaction, maybe it's a one-on-many transaction, as you imagine, say this dinner example. And one very simple kind of strategy that people have looked at quite a bit in this very restricted context that works pretty well is called tit for tat. So I'll do to you whatever you did to me last time. And if we're going to be interacting over and over again, that kind of simple retaliation in many cases can encourage people to behave well. Another possibility is if the group can exclude people that have this bad behavior. Ostracism can be a powerful motivating tool. And so these are a couple of approaches. But these simple scenarios, which have been studied both in the context experimentally of what people do, they've been studied in having little computer-based agents that play these games and so on in many different situations. They often will have a perfect connection between what you decide, what you intend to do, and what actually you do. So a connection between intent, which is what you're really after, and outcome and action. So generally there will be no noise. Whereas in the real world, you have well-intentioned, I'm going to get this package delivered to you, but my car has a flat tire. Okay, I mean, it doesn't mean that I was trying to deceive you or anything, it's just bad luck. So you can have situations where it makes it harder to evaluate if the package is late. Does it mean that you're a bad person, or does it mean that you just had some unlucky situations? And of course, if you're willing to believe a sob story, people who have no sob story whatsoever might be tempted to just tell you one anyway. Often these kind of simple scenarios don't give the agents or the people a choice of who they're going to play this game with, or who they're going to be, their potential business partners will be. So right off the bat, you don't even have the option of ostracizing people. And finally, these simple situations generally do not have a market context, so you can't see how does the behavior that people choose and various mechanisms and strategies, how does it affect simple market properties such as price and the market efficiency, and whether there are trades that would be beneficial that just don't happen. And so that leads us to look at experiments that do have a more economic context to them, so they're more complicated. And people basically have looked at two kinds here. One is what we call agency trust games, and the other is more of a full market scenario, which is what I'll be describing in what we did in our experiments. But let me just to show you the contrast, the idea of these agency trust games are some simple things like you have a pair of people, and one of them gets a pot of money. And they can decide some of that to give to the other person, and then that other person multiplies that amount of money, say, by 2 or 3. And then this second person, who's the agent, can choose to give some of it back. And they may choose to give none of it back. Okay? Or they could give all of it back. I mean, it's whatever their choice is. And so there you have a concern about how much do you trust this agent. We'd all be better off if I gave him all my money and it got doubled by this huge amount, and then say he gives half of it back to me, or something like that. But of course, he could just take it all and run. And if I'm really worried about that, well, maybe I'll just keep what I have, and at least I get something. There have also been some experiments in a similar context of looking at agent kind of decisions, looking at a one-sided market. And this you can think of as you're hiring a contractor, or you're hiring, say, a legal advisor, or a scenario like that. You have some risk. You get a pot of money. You have some risk that you're going to lose it. If you want, you can pay the agent some amount to reduce the chance of your loss. But the agent, in a sense, can work really hard or goof off. And those two cost the agent a different amount and give you a different benefit. So how is it that you can gauge whether the agent will do what they promise to do, which of course will be, I'll work really hard on your behalf, so give me lots of money. And it will be really good for both of us. So that's another kind of a reputation context. And both of these people have looked at in laboratory experiments. But what I'd like to turn to now is to describe some of the more full market scenarios that we've looked at in the last few years at HP. Again, a fairly simple market-based scenario where you have both buyers and sellers, and both sides can decide not to fulfill their contract, and everyone can decide who they want to do business with. So it's a bit more like a real market scenario rather than these, say, restrictive kinds of cooperative dilemmas that you, say, find in people who study pairwise prisoner's dilemma and so on. And our goal was then to compare different information policies and see what happens. What is it that people do? This kind of scenario, even though it's still quite restricted, is far too complicated to solve with game theory, in particular because it's hard to model what people believe about others. And you can say what an ideal rational player who knows everyone else is rational and so on should do, but that's not necessarily what people actually do. So then I'd like to describe a bit about the experimental setup and then talk about our results. So this is the HP Experimental Economics Lab. I want to describe to you, for those of you who haven't seen how these kind of experiments are set up, it's fairly simple. We get a group of people, usually they're Stanford students, 10 or 20 of them in for the afternoon. They're basically playing a computer game for real money. And here's the room. And we have this low-tech anti-collusion devices. They're just big poster boards. And so for most of the experiments that we do, we want to control all the information that people exchange. And we don't want them talking on the side and so on. And so this is our simple technology for that, plus the announcement that if they get caught talking when they shouldn't be and so on, they're going to lose the money that they should be earning in the experiment. So that works pretty well, but obviously not a very fancy technology. Now, how do we go about setting up one of these economic experiments? Again, conceptually, it's fairly simple. We're going to set up some kind of market. We have a group of people. Say we divide them in half. Some are sellers and some are buyers. And for each seller, the experimenter gives a card like this. So you're a seller, and I, the experimenter, will give you, and say for this particular seller, everyone will get different numbers. For this particular seller, I, the experimenter, will give you 1 unit to sell, and it'll cost you $5. And you can have 2 units, and it'll cost you $15, and so on. Generally set up in this kind of scenario where each extra unit costs a little bit more. It doesn't have to be that way. But that models the idea of increasing marginal costs in many kind of production tasks. Conversely, if you're a buyer, the experimenter goes to you and gives you a little card like this and says, if at the end of the experiment, you, buyer, who start out with nothing, with no units, if you give me 1 unit, I'll give you $10. And if you give me 2 units, I'll give you $12, say. Okay, and so everyone gets this card. It's private information. They don't know what everyone else gets. And in this particular context, for these 2 people, you can see that they do have an opportunity for a profitable trade. That is, if there's 1 unit that transacts at some price between $5 and $10, then the seller, let's say it's at $7, well, the seller gets $7 for this unit and has to pay $5 to the experimenter to get it, therefore a profit of $2. Similarly, the buyer gets the unit, has to pay $7 for it, but gets $10 from the experimenter, so a $3 profit for the buyer. So that's an example where there could be a profitable trade, assuming these people could find it. But in this particular example, again, if these were just the only 2 people involved, there would not be any profit for exchanging a second unit in this case. It would cost $15 for the seller to get 2 units, and is only worth at most $12 to the buyer. So this is an example of then how you go about setting up an economic experiment. You give this sort of information to each of the participants, and then they play a computer game which embodies whatever mechanism that you're trying to test out, like a stock market auction or whatever, or in our case, a reputation method. But this is how we induce supply and demand, that we as the experimenters know ahead of time what it is. So in our experiment, we had multiple buyers and sellers in a market. We allowed the players to restrict who it is they would allow their trades to, who it is they would either buy from or sell to, if they wished to do so. The particular mechanism was a discrete double auction. So this is similar to what goes on in say, the stock market. It might be unfamiliar to you if you're thinking of sort of just the normal one-sided auctions, like in an art auction or something you see particularly, say, in the movies. In a double auction, at any time, a seller can, say, post a price or accept one that a buyer has already declared, and vice versa. So going back to this example here, it might start out that the seller, of course, doesn't know how much things might be of value to the buyer, and maybe the seller says, well, look, I'll sell 1 unit for $20. And just sort of sits around waiting and doesn't see any buyers taking up that offer. And so then the seller might have to lower the price. But because it's a double auction, at the same time, a buyer can say, well, look, I will buy a unit for $3. And then the seller looks at that and says, well, I don't like that. Maybe I will either post another one, and maybe I'll say, okay, eventually I'll sell it for $7, and the buyer could think, well, should I take it? I can make a profit on that, or should I hold out for something, for something better? Maybe another buyer is going to take it. I have to weigh all those, weigh all those considerations. But that's how a double auction works. It's both parties can make offers, and either side can just pounce on one and accept it if they like it. We chose that not particularly because it's the only best kind of auction, but it's well known experimentally that sort of auction equilibrates very quickly. We were not interested in this particular experiment to look at how long it takes to get to market equilibrium or different auction mechanisms. Yeah.
Did you filter the participants for not having participated in this kind of experiment before?
Not in this case, no.
Okay. I'm concerned about if they haven't participated in this kind of experiment before, then they have essentially some statistical expectation of what the range of differences in prices might be.
So they might actually have economic experience, but what I haven't told you sort of all the details of the experiment, but we did announce ahead of time the overall supply and demand. So what you didn't know is who had necessarily the best price and so on. And so we did that particularly because we wanted the market to converge quickly. And we were looking at how is it people make decisions on who to do business with. Okay? And what changed from time to time is who had, say, the good deals and the bad deals. You wouldn't know that. But the overall, the aggregate supply and demand stayed the same in this particular experiment. But that's a good point. Okay, so in addition to the market, what made this an interesting from a reputation point of view is that people, after they've accepted some exchange, they said, okay, I'm willing to sell this for $7. After that part's all over, there was an additional decision round for this particular game where each person could decide whether they were going to fulfill their contract or not. And everybody does this simultaneously and without knowing what everybody else is going to do. So in this case, the buyer says, look, I promise to send $7, give you $7, but if I keep the $7, I'm $7 richer. And I could still get the unit if you give it to me. And similarly, the seller had to make that decision. Do I give the unit? It's going to cost me, say, $5 to give it to buy it from the experimenter. And if I don't give the unit, I don't have to pay that $5. And I keep it at the end of the day. So that's where the issue of cooperation or defection or trust and so on comes in this particular experiment. And then we just repeated this several times and with different scenarios and different groups of students over different days and so on. But that's the context of the experiment. So that's the setup. And now what we wanted to look at is one particular issue for reputation mechanisms is what about how much information that you have? And there's many ways that we could do this, but again, in a nice laboratory setting, we have a lot of control over what this information is. And so we looked basically at 3 different information policies. Number one was when you were going to potentially trade with someone, all you knew is how they treated you personally in the past. Okay? Did they fulfill contracts or not with you? That's all you knew. And that's sort of the low information context. And this you might think of is if you had no real reputation mechanism or information aggregation to aid you, all you might know is I've gone to this person before and I've either had good experiences or bad experiences. And then I make my decision based on that. The other extreme, we call the high information scenario, you have the personal history, of course, but we also presented to people how much of their prior contracts with everybody in the group did they fulfill over the course of the experiment. And we told people that this information was accurate. So we as the experimenters were providing this information, and therefore they knew it was an accurate representation of what actually happened. What they chose to do with that information was their business. And then a third case, which is motivated a lot by the eBay rating system, is a self-reporting feedback mechanism. Again, you have your personal experience. And now what we allowed people to do is give a score to every transaction. Did they like it or not like it? Okay. Plus or minus, 1 or 0. And what we presented to everyone when they were making their decisions on who they might want to enter into contracts with is the score that they got from all people that they've had transactions with in the past. Now, if everybody reported accurately, then this score would be the same as this high information case. But of course, they don't have to report accurately. They just say whatever they say whatever they want. And so this was an example where this kind of, if let's say you needed to do the high information case in order to get things to work well, but then you say, well, that's really costly. You have to have someone that can verify all the information and so on. Could you get away with just a self-reporting mechanism? Would that work more or less as well, or is it completely terrible? Yes.
Do they know how the other person forwarded their feedback?
Excuse me?
Do I know that if you gave me bad feedback?
You mean in the past or now? No, so this all happens in...
So we made a transaction.
Right.
And you rated me that I didn't fill it. Do I get that?
No, you're just showing aggregate. So you know your aggregate score.
But I don't know what other people gave me.
Well, you don't necessarily know, not individually, but you know your aggregate score. And so say at the very beginning, you could see if you wanted to how that changed. And so that actually is an interesting kind of extra variation. We could look at a little bit more on breaking out that kind of detail. Would that matter? People could have various kind of punishment strategies. And yeah, so these are three choices that we did. And there are plenty more other interesting ones too. In these experiments, the only failure, the only way people could choose, if you like, not to cooperate is by not fulfilling their contracts. In this context, it's like everybody agrees on what makes good behavior versus bad behavior. It's not like, say, movie recommendations, where you can get a recommendation from someone and you think, oh, this is the greatest recommendation and I'll always listen to this person. Someone else gets the same recommendation because their taste in movies is quite different. They say, oh, those are terrible recommendations. I'm never going to listen to those. That would be a different kind of a reputation context when it depends partly on different people evaluating what it means to be a good or bad transaction. In this context, it's simpler. That is, everyone agrees that if you get money, it's better than not getting the money, and if you get a promised good, it's better than not getting it. So it's a much simpler context in which the reputation takes place. But that's not to say that's the only kind of situation in which reputation is important. So let me talk a little bit about our results. We looked a bit at aggregate behaviors, that is, how did it affect the market, and then a little bit more at individual behaviors. And I'll just go through these, and if you have any that are particularly interesting to you, we can stop and spend a bit more time on them. So here is what we saw with aggregate market statistics, and we don't really have a good understanding of why this happened. And we've tried a number of simple kinds of models and haven't been able to find a good one yet. But basically what we see is that you have different amounts of fulfillment in different parts of the experiment. The price pretty much stays around what we as the experimenters know should be the equilibrium according to economic theory and so on. But the trading volume has a rather different kind of behavior, and that is when fulfillment is low, the volume of contracts people enter into is higher, possibly because they think, well, I don't expect anyone to fulfill it. Maybe I have to have a lot of contracts, but I don't have to fulfill them either, or whatever. We don't know what's going on in their heads that would explain consistently all these three aggregate statistics. And so that's an interesting open question. And the third one is what we call market efficiency. And that's basically the question is, at the end of the day, how much of the money at the experimenter that we had on the table for them did they go home with? And so ideally, if every case where there was, say, a $5 that could match with a $10 in that supply and demand, if every case had a transaction, so they went home with as much money as they could extract out of the experimenters as possible, then that would be a high efficiency case. Yeah.
Your graph on efficiency shows dots above 100%.
Mm-hmm.
What does that mean?
So I guess I didn't mention, we also had noise in this experiment. So sometimes, this is to distinguish between intent and delivery. So sometimes you could intend to deliver something, and like 10% of the time it would just disappear in the mail. Okay. So this theoretical efficiency is with respect to the average noise. Now, in some experiments, it could just be you're lucky to have a little bit less noise than this 10% just by the flip of the coin. And if lots of people fulfill, in that case, you can be a bit higher. This question always comes up, and I'm always trying to think if there should be some simple way of explaining that. But it turns out it's good. You can see if anyone is paying attention of how can efficiency be above 100%. And so it's really what's in the denominator there. Good question. Was that? your question as well. So the market efficiency was really quite high when fulfillment was high, and one reason for this is that the contracts that were not fulfilled tended to be ones that would not trade in equilibrium anyway. And so perhaps someone really made a really good deal, and the reason it's a good deal is because they didn't intend to fulfill it. Maybe. We don't know, again, what's going on inside people's heads. But that transaction should not have happened anyway if the market were really efficient and everyone was rational. So that kind of unfulfilled contract results in a wealth transfer. That is, someone gets money that the other person maybe should have had. But it doesn't change the amount that we as the experimenters or the market as a whole gets from the trade. So there are other things besides efficiency that are important for markets. But that's one of the things that we observed happening in the high fulfillment case. And here's an example. I'd like to show you just a little bit of data of what actually happened. So we say in this case ran the experiments for 12 to 16 times, and you see toward the end, although we don't announce the end of the game until 2 periods ahead of time, people know that when the clock's getting near 5 p.m., it's getting near the end of the game. And so what you see here, of course, is toward the end of the game, I have no benefit from having a high reputation. I'm not going to be playing with these people much anymore. So hey, I might as well take the money and run. And so everyone knows that, and we just sort of see this whole crash here. And so it's fortunate that we were able to run the experiments long enough to at least see some discrimination early on. One thing that rational players could say is, well, look, I know at the very end no one's going to bother to fulfill, because they're not going to care about reputation. And so the time before that, there's no point in fulfilling, because even if I have a high reputation, they're not going to give me anything anyway. And you just backwardly induce that and say, well, I shouldn't do any fulfillment in the beginning. In some sense, that's a nice prediction of rational game theory. It's not what people do. And it's fortunate for them because they can walk home with more money than if they didn't do any trades at all. We also had a look at self-reporting accuracies, which turned out to be very high in this experiment. So over 90% of the cases, people reported a transaction, whether it was good or bad, based on what actually happened in that transaction. But the inaccurate cases have a high bias toward bad reports. And again, we don't know why this is. Maybe people are punishing for things that happened further in the past, or they're just upset about things, or they're trying to, who knows what.
I don't understand the second bullet. The inaccurate cases. Can you just explain that some more?
So if we look here, there's cases of what actually happened. You received your money or good, or you didn't receive it, and this is what rating you gave. Did I say it was a good thing or not? So the accurate ones are here and here. You received it. You said it was good. Here are the inaccurate ones. I did not receive it, but I said it was good transaction, and vice versa. And we just see that this box tends to be bigger than that box. And again, it's an observation. Don't have a good reason for that. We also saw some behaviors that are similar to what I described to you with some of the earlier, simpler situations. We did see some evidence of tit for tat. People would punish by not fulfilling with contracts with people who had, in essence, didn't fulfill their contracts in the past. And so from these experiments, we can get both information about market behavior. We can compare different information policies and get some idea of individual behavior. And we do find that information policy is a strong determinant of how well the market works. At least in this context, self-reporting was pretty much as good as high information, although it has some biased errors. And non-fulfillment was occasionally used as retaliation. Now, more recently, we've also done some comparisons with a particular website. So I mentioned there are these different approaches to evaluating mechanisms: game theory, field studies, and laboratory experiments. Prosper.com is a simple microfinance website, which involves getting lots of people to aggregate together to loan money to people that would have a hard time getting it, say, from banks or have to pay high interest rates. And we were comparing what we saw in our experiment with what we saw with evidence of happening on Prosper. And then also, just for comparison, I'd like to see what happens with these much simpler models that I talked about, these simple scenarios. And In particular, we see when we compare with the simple scenarios, they don't allow people to do a lot of interesting behavior. So you can't see it even if you wanted to. You don't have the ability to exclude and so on. One interesting thing, we didn't see evidence in our experiments of price discrimination. That is, I could give a bad deal to someone that has a low reputation, and maybe they're desperate enough that they have to take it. We didn't see evidence of that. We saw a lot more evidence of people just ostracize and don't refuse to do business with people. But it's interesting to compare what do our experiments do with what happens in some field studies. A variety of open issues. It would be nice to have a comprehensive theory that describes how these different mechanisms work in practice with real people. How might people use strategic reporting? What about specialization? If different people are somewhat more monopolistic situations, could they afford to have a lower reputation but people have to deal with them anyway? What about identity change? You have a bad reputation, you just sort of go offline for a while and log back in with a new name. And how do people connect that up? Can you make use of networks of trust that we devise in social networks so that you value reputation reports from your friends more than just some random stranger who might be the friend of the other person and you don't know that? There's a variety of broader issues. Going back to the three approaches that I mentioned in trying to encourage good behavior. Finding combinations of technology, mechanisms, and public policy. How does that depend on culture? And I would just like to point out, if you're interested in this, there's a couple of good books that describe a bit more of the policy context around some of these issues. And both these people are really great speakers if you ever have an opportunity to hear them, that look a lot at the social and policy issues, with the emphasis being it's not just technology. Technology enables a lot of new things, gives us new problems, new capabilities, new opportunities, but it's important to keep in mind the context. And these are two places that you might find that helpful. OK, and so if you have any questions?
Yeah, the game you played, how many of the players went home with quite a bit more money than the other players? Or was the money won fairly evenly?
Typically, the range in our experiments was about $75 to $150, and so that would be about the range. What they would, and yeah, some people have either better luck or better traders or for whatever reason. So that's the range.
Performers with 10.
So that was the range in this particular experiment. Yeah, pretty much.
What about the distribution? Is the question about the distribution?
Yeah, what was it?
Oh, it's pretty much like a bell curve, but not in all experiments. And just in this particular one, yeah, it's like that.
Did you see any attempts at signaling behavior, like signaling through the offers and that sort of thing?
No, I mean, there certainly could have been, but not anything that we saw.
Outside of the experiments, do you have any stories or examples of signaling behavior that exists through, let's say, on eBay or other places?
Well, I mean, there are some examples in much larger scale auctions of companies using some digits of their prices to signal to their competitors what they should or shouldn't be bidding. And the question is, you could design experiments that tried to pick those kind of things out too, or situations in which that would be profitable. And in this context, the amount of time that people have, we give them a couple minutes per round and so on, plus they don't have a chance ahead of time to sort of sit in the back room and decide, hey, this is what we should do. Makes that harder, but you certainly could have situations like that.
So I guess then related to that is you had in this experiment prevented collusion.
Mm-hmm. We tried to, yeah.
In the real world, are there phenomena now of sort of side channels and is that happening where there is sort of broad collusion among people who may have these kind of black networks to try to?
Well, they don't tell anyone, but
Is there evidence?
What there is, and certainly is side discussions. So it's another way of sharing reputation information. And so you might say, well, I'm thinking of doing business with this person. Is there anyone else that has done? So I actively seek information. You're going to have side conversations like that. It's another thing the internet facilitates. And of course, you can read things that people say that may or may not be true, and you have to make an evaluation on that as well. Thank you. Anything else? Okay. Thanks for your time.